This is the story of a supposedly cursed apartment complex. Let me be clear, these are actual stories that I collected while working on an article. I don't believe them to be literally true. I consider them something like urban folktales. But I'm sure you know that folklore tends to refer to real historical events that have become mythologized over time. While it isn't real in and of itself, folklore points to something real, something that actually happened. It's my belief that the stories I collected from the former residents of this apartment complex secretly document an actual murder. A murder that was never solved. A murder that hit the residents so hard that it gained semi-mythical status and was transformed by their common imagination into a variety of folktales, which I will share with you. The question at the heart of these stories is, if this murder did in fact occur, what made it so unusual as to stand out in the minds of those who knew about it? To figure that out, let me begin by giving you a little background. The article I was working on was supposed to be an examination of poverty, told through the voices of everyday people who had resided in the projects. In particular, I spoke to the former residents of one sprawling apartment complex known as Pruitt Igoe, PIC related. Long story short, things very quickly went sideways as people began to tell me some crazy stories about the place. So let me paint you a picture. Late 1950s St. Louis, Missouri. Huge homeless problem demands a solution. The city pours money into the construction of a gigantic low-rent apartment complex. By gigantic, I mean 33 buildings total, each 11 stories high, PIC related. The entire complex spanned roughly 60 acres. The place was called Pruitt Igoe, as in Pruitt Igoe, and it was sort of a symbol of urban renewal. City planners hoped it would serve as a shining example for future housing officials. But things went south right away. Not even 4 hours into Pruitt Igoe's existence, residents just started abandoning ship. City planners couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. To make a long story short, within 20 years the whole complex was leveled to the ground. It was originally built to house 10,000 people. By the end, only about 600 lived there. So the question on everyone's mind was, what exactly went wrong? Was it white flight, a common explanation? Was it all the damn corners they cut building the place that just made it unlivable? Was it the size? Did it create an isolating environment where people felt suffocated, trapped, and cut off from the rest of the world? Even decades later, nobody can really tell you for sure. Today, Pruitt Igoe doesn't serve as a shining example of anything except what not to do. I decided I wouldn't tell the story chronologically, because I want you to see how I came to my conclusion, that a bizarre, highly significant, and disturbing murder occurred at Pruitt Igoe. So I'm gonna build a case. To do so, it might be best to start with an urban legend. This one was known to virtually all of the former residents that I spoke to. Each person had a slightly different version, but I'll give you the gist. I call it the black car. It's late. The sun has gone down. Some children are still lingering outside playing when a black car rolls through the parking lot. It pulls up to the entrance of the building. A man exits the building, approaches the black car, and gets into the back seat. The car then begins to drive out of the complex, passing the children as it goes. They watch as the car rolls by. As it passes, its windows roll down to reveal that the car is empty. The man who entered the car has vanished, and there's nobody at the wheel. The car turns down the road as if somebody is driving. Then, it disappears. Just to remind you, I know this is only an urban legend. I don't believe it to be literally true. Here's a different version before I move on. There's a black car that travels throughout the city. It's completely invisible. Its engine is totally silent. It moves through the streets and neighborhoods, picking up the souls of dead people. Other times, it is seen by those who are soon going to die. If you see it, you're next. I have 2 reasons for sharing this story. 1. I spoke with numerous former residents of Pruitt Igoe and consistently heard the same story in different forms. 2. This story seems to be peculiar to Pruitt Igoe. I haven't come across a similar story anywhere else, and yet I've never heard it shared in any text about Pruitt Igoe. Probably because sociologists and historians aren't that interested in collecting folklore. There's also a personal reason. I've come to feel that this particular legend is a key because it seems to tie into other stories that residents told me, and that I'll share here. Their stories tell of murders, police cover-ups, and even an entire apartment building that disappeared. To get to that, let me move from pure folklore to some first-hand stories. Pick-related is the demolition of one of Pruitt Igoe's buildings. I'll start with this one. Barry, 62 years old, former resident of Pruitt Igoe, 1956 through 1959. His parents very abruptly moved out of Pruitt Igoe when he was only a child. He has no recollection of this. All he remembers is that they moved very suddenly overnight. Later, he would frequently ask his parents why they moved. They never told him. Barry's father died young, leaving behind an older brother, Barry's uncle. Barry and his uncle reunited at Barry's father's funeral. They spoke for a long time, and somehow Pruitt Igoe came up. Barry's uncle claimed that he received a phone call from Barry's father in the middle of the night prior to their moving out. Barry's father sounded nervous. He asked Barry's uncle if he could bring his family and move in with him. Barry's uncle said of course. He thought maybe Barry's father was in trouble, but never got any details out of him. A few years before his death, Barry's father told Barry's uncle something strange. He said that a man had been murdered in Pruitt Igoe, that it had been hushed up, and even the man's apartment had been sealed over. A number of them had been threatened, and that's when Barry's father decided to leave. Interestingly, Barry didn't believe this story himself. He said he thought his uncle probably exaggerated the truth or even made it up. Maybe because he was grieving and needed to make sense of his brother's death. Actually, before I share another first-hand encounter, let me take you to Robert. Robert, 56 years old, resident of Pruitt Igoe, 1966 through 1972. A little girl is found killed in Robert's building. He's playing with some kids downstairs. Robert brings up the little girl's death. An older girl is with them. She tells a story about a man who died at Pruitt Igoe. She says it happened a long time ago when Pruitt Igoe was first built. He was an old man who lived alone. One day someone found his body in his room. It had become a pile of dirt. Later, another girl gets killed. About the same age as the one that died in Robert's building. She'd been raped and her skull had been bashed in. Robert hears the same story that the older girl told him, only from someone else and slightly different. An old man died when Pruitt Igoe was first built. Every year someone new dies. It's the spirit of the old man taking people. Pick-related is a news article about a girl that died. Even after all these years, he still remembered her name. Kathy McKellen, 9 years old, was found killed yesterday on the 9th floor of the housing development. She lived in apartment 1000 of the building at 2420 Cass. It was the second time within a year that a girl had been found killed in Pruitt Igoe. I think I'll move on to Miss Susan's story next. Miss Susan, 60 years old, former resident of Pruitt Igoe, 1961 through 1966. I've actually caught her on a day that her adult granddaughter happened to be visiting. She's the one who tells Miss Susan to tell me about the time you found something that looked like a dead person. So Miss Susan tells me a story. She claims to have come across a body lying outside in the parking lot next to a brick wall. She never saw the face because it was covered in dirt. Looked like someone had poured it to cover up the entire head. She stresses to me that she was only about 10 at the time, and it probably was her imagination running away with her. She isn't even sure if she saw what she thinks she saw. Then she explains that there were a number of stories associated with a particular building where she saw the body. I ask if she'll share those stories. She says she doesn't remember them anymore. Only one that her older brother used to tell to scare her. She only remembers this fragment. There was a man who lived at Pruitt Igoe, but he disappeared one day, and all they found was a skull lying in front of that particular building. Now keep in mind, my interviews are covering a lot of ground. This is not the only thing I'm talking to these people about. This is only what I'm sharing with you, compiling it in a certain way so that you can see what I'm getting at. In my mind, an image is starting to form, an image of murder or a death or a disappearance, something that these people are nervous about. Some event has become part of the collective imagination. With that said, let me tell you a ghost story that one woman shared with me. It's not very scary, but you can see how it ties in with other things I've shared thus far. Gladys, 61 years old, former resident of Pruitt Igoe, 1960 to 1963. According to her, people used to say that the spirits of those who lived in Pruitt Igoe stayed trapped there, trapped in a hidden place that nobody could see. The dead could not leave this place, but the living could sometimes wander into it accidentally. Then they would find themselves trapped with the spirits of the dead. Their bodies would never be found. So bear with me. I know you don't need me to spell it all out for you, but I do want to state what my thoughts are at the point in my investigation. The stories are piling up, and they don't seem disconnected at all. There's a theme here. Miss Susan's story is about a man that disappears and is presumed dead, although his body is never found. Gladys's story is about people who never die. They disappear, yet they reside with the dead. Their bodies are also never found. Barry's story is about a man who is murdered, and yet the real story is that the story remains buried. In the urban legend about the black car, the man who gets inside vanishes. Are these stories, which appear to be totally different, actually different versions of the same thing? Are people dying, or are they going missing? Or is it somehow both? With those questions in mind, I'll share another bit of local folklore before I move on. Molly, 64 years old, former resident of Pruitt, Igoe, 1958 through 1966. Our conversation moved to the topic of urban legends. She shared many of the ones she remembered from her childhood. Most of them are silly and made her laugh, but one of them she strangely seemed to take seriously. A story about a building in Pruitt, Igoe. This particular building was supposed to be cursed. Anybody that moved into an apartment in that building died. Molly couldn't remember which building this story referred to. With that, let me take you to Aunt Rose. This was an interesting one because Aunt Rose actually seemed to remember most of the weird stories that people told about Pruitt, Igoe. She's the one who told me the second version of the black car story that I shared to start off the thread. Aunt Rose, 76 years old, former resident of Pruitt, Igoe, 1959 through 1970. She claimed that the black car from the stories was real. It used to come around and park in front of this particular building. She and the other kids called this building the Hex, oddly enough. It was one of the buildings next to the one Aunt Rose lived in. She stressed to me that she and the other children used to see this fancy black car all the time. It would roll up, park in front of the Hex, and sometimes adults would usher them inside. Other times, adults just ignored it, like it wasn't even there. Either way, nothing ever happened while it was there, but Aunt Rose and the other children learned to be wary of it. Every time it came around, Aunt Rose claimed someone would die shortly afterward. Not a regular death, but in a manner that didn't make much sense. She and the others took to calling the black car the Grim Reaper. She said years before people saw the Grim Reaper pull into the building, it was very late. The next day, a man was found dead in his bed. They found him covered in dirt, like he'd been pulled out of a grave. This is really the last round of posts before I leave you guys. I guess I should also have warned you that there's no real punchline to all of this. I'll wrap it up in a bit, but first, my interview with Dave. Dave, 75 years old, former resident of Pruitt, Igoe, 1955 through 1957. His family moved in when Pruitt, Igoe first opened. We moved out before things got real bad, he told me. I've asked him if there was any specific reason. He gave several, but one is relevant. The final straw was when they found a man murdered in his bed. I realized as he told his story, he's weaving together two things. Something he's been told and something that he remembers firsthand. Let's get to the firsthand info first. Dave was one of the oldest people I interviewed. He was already about 15 or 16 at the time when he moved into Pruitt, Igoe. He was going through a rebellious phase and hanging out late after dark a lot with some other boys. One of these nights, he came home sometime after 3 a.m. and found a couple of squad cars near his building. The police stopped him. They really shook Dave up. He thought he was going to be arrested. One of the officers asked, "Do you live here?" To which Dave responds by giving his full name, address, and the name of his parents. Then one of them makes a vague threat like, "We know who you are and where you live." They basically tell him to get home and keep his mouth shut. He's confused but relieved. The next day he hears about a man who was found murdered in his building. Never heard about it in the papers or on the news. Very shortly thereafter, Dave and his family moved out of Pruitt, Igoe. That ends what Dave actually witnessed. Here's what he heard. Dave had a friend who still lived in Pruitt, Igoe. They used to play basketball together sometimes. Once, after a little one-on-one, they're sitting around, talking, and Dave brings up the murder at Pruitt, Igoe. His friend goes on to tell him a weird story. Dave's friend says that the man who died had a friend. His friend grew worried because the man hadn't been seen in a while, so the friend went to go check on him. Apparently the man's door was unlocked, and that friend went inside. He came out, spooked, told someone that his friend had been murdered and not to call the police. The story goes that the man's friend had found the apartment unusually clean, floors mopped, walls and counters scrubbed. The place smelled like disinfectant. The guy went into the man's room and found it in the same condition. Very clean. Only two things were dirty: the bed, which had some type of mess on it, and the ceiling directly above the bed. Not long afterward, they bricked up the man's apartment. It was all gone. I'll cap off these stories with a little story of my own. I wrote my paper, which included almost none of what I've shared here, and submitted it to a journal several years ago. Nobody read it, but I worked on several other things that had been asked at various conferences. At one of those, I met a person who did read my paper. In it, I included one single story that I've shared here. The person introduced themselves, and it became apparent immediately that they had ties to the St. Louis Housing Authority. They mentioned that one weird folktale that I shared. We talked about it, and I mentioned some of my tame speculations, after which they shared a joke that some of the old housing officials used to tell. It's a story, really, and it goes like this. A board of commissioners once made a pact with the devil. They needed a new building constructed, but didn't have the money. So the devil shows up and tells them they'll build it for them, no charge. Or rather, no monetary compensation. And all he wants is a new soul every year. The board of commissioners agrees. The devil is a master mason and finishes the building in no time. But the board changes its mind and tells the devil to fuck off. So, Satan decides to get even. He adds another room to the building, with a door that nobody can see. Every year, people accidentally walk through that door. Those that do lose their souls. And that's how the devil built Pruitt, Igoe, and how he outwitted the St. Louis Housing Authority. So, it turns out the folklore didn't stop with the residents of Pruitt, Igoe. Although this story is different from the one that residents told, more traditional. In fact, it's an updated version of an old European legend. You can find it in England and Germany in various forms. Anyway, I thanked him for the story, and he asked if I knew who designed Pruitt, Igoe. I told him I did. A Japanese architect named Minoru Yamasaki. Spooky, he said. Yamasaki also designed the World Trade Center. Spooky. Anyway, that's all I have. Some parting thoughts before I go. Maybe I'm reading too much into all of this. Maybe these stories actually reflect a more general truth about Pruitt, Igoe. Remember, one by one the residents left the place. In the process, they abandoned their neighbors, family seemingly left behind to die. Nobody much cared then, and does anybody care now? Maybe this is why so many of the stories insist that the dead are still with us, and that they don't die but only disappear. Do we make them disappear? Do we let them die? Those that managed to escape Pruitt, Igoe, and those that stayed behind trapped, they're the same people, connected by the suffering they experienced. And when the housing authority demolished the last of the 33 buildings, they didn't wipe away the suffering that occurred there. They just brought down the rubble on top of it. Maybe that's what the stories mean. That it's all still there, waiting to be heard. Take care, Rex.